All right, this screencast is going to cover basic lawmaking, and then we're going to get into the presidency. So here we go. You are probably not going to be asked on the AP exam necessarily about this process, but it is good to know to have a broader understanding of the interactions that take place between the House and the Senate, and especially between the presidency. So here we go. First of all, it's probably a good observation that the lawmaking process can be a very arduous and difficult process, or it can be an incredibly abbreviated process depending on several factors like the presence of divided government or the existence of some sort of national emergency like we're in right now. So let's start with the basic flowchart. This is something I found online. You can just Google how a bill becomes a law and you can find it for yourself if you'd like to have it to look on. Now, for starters, bills can start in either the House or Senate, and there's a lot of commonalities in the process. So the first stage is introduction. Introducing a bill in either house is very simple. An individual member can introduce a bill. It does not take a lot of pageantry or procedural steps to introduce a bill. Once a bill is introduced, then it gets forwarded to a relevant committee or subcommittee, and this occurs both in the House and the Senate. And most bills never make it out of committee. And there are a number of committees that a typical bill may find itself in. For example, if it's an agricultural bill, it may end up in Ways and Means, which is the tax committee. It may end up, obviously, in the agriculture committee, but it could also end up in energy and commerce if, let's say, there was something that impacted the flow of commerce, or maybe there was an ethanol subsidy or something like that. So bills, it's not as if it just goes to one committee and that's where the action is and that's what happens. So on the House side, lots and lots and lots of committee action. And there's committee action on the Senate side as well. But you should all understand that this is not a process that goes from one house then to the other house. Sometimes bills start in each house, and you have a Senate version and a House version tracking through simultaneously. And of course, they go at their different paces because of the nature of the differences between the House and the Senate. But let's go through the basic steps. Once it's in committee, lots of things can happen to it. It can be marked up. There can be amendments added. A lot of pork barrel spending gets added at this stage. If you're the chairman of the committee, you have the option of pigeonholing the bill if it's something you don't like. So if the opposite party has proposed a bill and it ends up in your committee, you simply just bury the thing and it'll never see the light of day. And of course, same is true on the Senate side. So once that bill is out of committee, and the way it gets out of committee, by the way, is by a majority vote scheduled by the committee chairman. Once that is voted out of committee, then it goes in the House side to the House calendar, the Rules Committee most likely. It goes to the full House for consideration in what's called the Committee of the Whole. And then if it passes through all that, then you have the House version that is passed. Don't forget, by the way, bills are numbered. So a bill introduced in the House would be HR 1. A bill introduced in the Senate would be S1. Not sure whether they have them reversed in this particular diagram, but I digress. On the Senate side, it's the same exact process. There's a committee stage, there's a markup voted on by the full committee. It's put on the calendar, goes to the Senate for the floor vote, and once you have that process, then you have a Senate version. So that's an important detail. You have a House version and a Senate version. Another important detail is that these bills are likely to be very different because you have different constituencies. In the House, you have legislation that is probably representative of the concerns of the large states because there's so many representatives and the larger states have more representatives, and they also have more power on the committees because they have seniority because of gerrymandering, which creates safe legislative seats where members accumulate power by getting reelected over and over again. That doesn't apply in the Senate, where every state is on equal footing. So you can have the concerns of these small states represented more so in the Senate than in the House. So it's very important to understand why there would be differences between the House and Senate versions. And there almost always are. And you may remember in class I used shapes to illustrate the differences. We had a triangle or something for the House version, a square for the Senate version or something like that, and then something even different for the conference committee version. Now, once there is a House and Senate version, you cannot send either or to the president. There has to be one version. So I can enlarge this a little bit. If either chamber has a similar bill, a joint committee resolves the differences. That joint committee, by the way, is called a conference committee. So it's not very well represented in this particular infographic, but like I said, I just found it on the web, and it's good enough for our purposes. When a bill is finalized in conference, so the conference committee has done its work, that means the differences between the House and Senate versions have been ironed out, and you have identical language that has to go back before the full House and the full Senate one last time. And then and only then does the president get his hands on the bill. And of course, he has a constitutional option of vetoing the bill if he does not like it, in which case the bill is dead almost every time. And we're going to come back to this stuff when we go through the outline, but just to give you some initial guidance on it. The president has several options when presented with a bill. He can veto it. If he vetoes it, it goes back to the House and Senate, and that triggers a 2/3 vote threshold to defeat a presidential veto. Very, very tough to do, particularly with the presence of divided government. So the other option, obviously, the president can sign it. If he signs it, the bill becomes a law. The third option is the president can do nothing. And the Constitution has specific language dealing with this contingency. Let's go to Article 1, Section 7 and check it out. Every bill which shall have been passed, the House and the Senate shall, before it become a law, be presented to the President of the United States. That, you may remember, is called the presentment clause. Every bill has to be presented. It's his prerogative to weigh in on legislation. The House and Senate cannot self-actuate legislation just because they have unanimous votes. It still requires the president's approval. But the Founding Fathers understood there would be a variety of circumstances, so they have this provision: if any bill shall not be returned by the president within 10 days, Sunday's accepted. So you can see the Founding Fathers had a little deference to religion there. After it shall have been presented to him, the same shall be a law. So there's a 10-day clock that starts running the minute the bill hits the president's desk, the minute the presentment clause is invoked. But if there are fewer than 10 days left, the bill dies. That's called a pocket veto. Unless Congress, by their adjournment, prevent its return, in which case it shall not be a law. And by the way, a pocket veto is technically not a veto. We mentioned in class this was the equivalent of running out the clock in a sporting event. There's a certain amount of time allotted according to the Constitution, and if the session ends because Congress adjourns and there haven't been 10 days go by and the president didn't sign it, the bill is dead. Cannot be resurrected by an override vote because it was never acted upon by the president, never vetoed. So going back to this infographic, kind of gets into some of these possibilities, talking about pork barrel and earmarks and the filibuster and all that. We've kind of been over all that stuff. And here it talks about the veto. So if you want this, like I said, it's pretty easy to find online. Just Google how a bill becomes a law. But anyway, there is one other statement, and for that, I'm going to go over to the review outline and talk about some of these informal powers, specifically signing statements. A signing statement is when the president signs a bill but adds information as he's signing the bill, typically an explanation of things that he doesn't like about the bill. Signing statements have become more prevalent because there are several instances where presidents really don't like things that are in legislation. Maybe there's too much pork barrel spending or something like that. But they know the legislation is important and they're under pressure to sign it, so they go ahead and sign it, which does activate the law. But a signing statement gives the president a way to interject some of his own thoughts on the constitutionality of that. And of course, that can lay the groundwork for legal challenges down the road. And of course, this is why signing statements are often referred to as a poor man's line item veto. A line item veto, if it were available to the president, would allow him to cross out individual portions of a law that he doesn't like. And of course, the problem with that is it violates the presentment clause. The House and Senate, under the Constitution, have the right to review legislation directly before it goes to the president. If the president is sitting there editing legislation that is denying the House and Senate their constitutionally reserved role in the lawmaking process. So now that we've done that little review, let's go ahead and go back to the outline. Look at our enduring understanding. The presidency has been enhanced beyond its express constitutional powers. So if you haven't figured it out, the growth of power is a major theme of the course, and it occurs both in terms of what Congress can do, what the courts have been able to do, and the presidency. Much to the dismay of people who are opposed to national power, it seems that the Anti-Federalists and the concerns expressed in Brutus I in many cases were absolutely correct. But we're a different country than at that time, so there's always room for debate. But anyway, so first objective, explain how the president can implement a policy agenda. So I think one of the first observations about presidential power is that the Constitution doesn't say much about it. And this is from your Unit 1 and 2 packet, just to review this if you happen to have it handy. It's a good thing to keep close by. President has 6 formal enumerated powers. That's not very many. He's commander-in-chief. He can make treaties with foreign nations subject to Senate approval, very tough approval, by the way, 2/3 vote approval. President can veto legislation, again, subject to congressional override. President has the appointment power. Very important power, by the way, because the appointment power allows him to shape his administration. And of course, that includes not just the cabinet, but also, very importantly, members of the judiciary and the Supreme Court. He can issue pardons and reprieves and can make recess appointments. And that's about it. So there is no long laundry list of presidential powers. The founding fathers understood that this was something new and that presidents would basically have to make it up as they go along. And that's exactly what has transpired. And as we've gone through this journey with the United States, there have been all sorts of instances where presidents have been called upon to make very difficult decisions, including the time period we happen to be living through right now. So, if the list of formal powers is short, does that mean the president has limited powers? Quite the contrary. In fact, the absence of enumerated powers opens the door wide open for implied powers, because don't forget, under the Constitution, the president, first and foremost, above all else, is the chief executive. And the Constitution says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. Doesn't define what that means, but it does mean that he is the one person, and again, this is straight out of Federalist 70, A one-person executive is what was contemplated. Going back to the outline, let's go ahead and take a look at these powers. He can issue vetoes and pocket vetoes. Don't forget that's a running out the clock type of veto, not an actual veto. And these are formal powers that allow the president to check Congress. Looks like a little typo there. He has foreign policy powers, namely the power to make treaties. Of course, that is severely restricted by the 2/3 ratification requirement of the Senate. But executive agreements are a possibility, which the Constitution does not mention, but it's something that presidents have been doing for a long time. These informal agreements with foreign powers that do not require any action by the Senate. Now, the most important power that presidents have by far is the next one, bargaining and persuasion. We call this the bully pulpit. The idea that, maybe I should write that one down. And we can margin notes. Bully pulpit, very important concept. And it's basically the president using the power of the office, the pageantry of the office, the incredible attention that it gets in the media and elsewhere to drive an agenda. So this is not a formal power, it's an informal power, and successful presidents are really, really good at it. When Reagan was president, he went right up to the Berlin Wall, gave a speech, wagged his finger at Mr. Gorbachev and said,
"There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate." Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And everybody thought that was crazy. In fact, that was an ad-lib part of the speech, but Reagan knew that that would be a very powerful moment. So he ignored the advice of his speechwriters. And of course, just a few short years later, the world changed with the reunification of Germany and they tore down the Berlin Wall. So it's an amazing thing. Kennedy. We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Challenge the world to go to the moon. Challenge the United States to go to the moon. It was technically impossible at the time he proposed that, but the words inspired a generation of people to do research and advancements in science that were previously thought to be impossible, and lo and behold, we went to the moon. Or at least they made it look like we did. So this is a very, very important thing. All successful presidents have to be able to persuade. And it, quite frankly, speaks to the same skill set that you need to get elected. If you can convince the country that you can run the country and actually achieve the office of the United States president, you probably already have this one in the bag. And of course, there's some presidents that are better at it than others, but almost every president has this ability. Some other powers that are worth mentioning: executive orders. This is not a formal power, it's an implied power based on the president's power as chief executive. And in some cases, executive orders can be delegated to the president or to the bureaucracy by Congress. And we already talked about signing statements. So let's take a look at a practice question. The president is most likely to use an executive order to make important policy when Congress is dominated by the president's party. Well, that's silly. That would be the opposite of what would happen. A compromise cannot be reached with Congress. There's probably your answer. Let's read the rest of them. The Supreme Court is divided along ideological lines. That's always the case. A negotiation with foreign heads of state reaches an impasse. So B is our correct answer. Presidents are most likely to use an executive order when it's just too tough to work with Congress. Next up, explain how the president's agenda can create tension and frequent confrontations with Congress. This is something that we are witnessing every day. If you have any awareness whatsoever of what's happening in government, this conflict is just the way things are. So the potential for conflict with the Senate depends upon the type of executive branch appointments, including cabinet members, ambassadors, the White House staff. Senate confirmation is an important check on appointment powers, but the president's longest-lasting influence lies in life-tenured judicial appointments, which we have already discussed at length. Policy initiatives and executive orders promoted by the president often lead to conflict with the congressional agenda. So this is really all about this idea of checks and balances. Think of the constituencies that exist within Congress. You have every state has Congress people, both at the Senate side and the House side, that are trying to do things for their states. The states are very different, and so you have this constant tug of war between the states to implement what they want to do. And so you have a lot of states, for example, that are pursuing a green energy type of agenda. And then you have states like Texas, which I think we have a large number of wind farms, but we're primarily oil and gas. So if California is pushing solar and that's going to impact the policy regarding Texas, that's going to create tension, obviously, on the House side. And of course, the president has his agenda as well. And oftentimes that can conflict. The most notable one, as I've often joked about, is the wall. And that's something that is clearly part of the president's agenda and not so much with Congress. So the president has used emergency powers, military powers to build the wall because he couldn't work with Congress. So let's look at another sample question. Which of the following is an example of how separation of powers creates friction between the executive and legislative branches in the policy-making process? Friction between the executive and legislative branches. And of course, we're focusing on separation of powers. So that means we're going to have tension between the president and Congress. The Electoral College vote ends with no candidate receiving a majority of votes, and the House of Representatives has delegated the task of selecting the next president. That is a very rare occurrence. So let's factor that out as a distractor for now. The Senate votes to impeach a sitting president for high crimes and misdemeanors. And don't forget, we're focused on the policy-making process. Secretary of State is dispatched along with a delegation of senators to negotiate a treaty with the foreign government. The president threatens to issue an executive order for stricter gun control if Congress refuses to take action. There's our classic battle between Congress and the president. And this is going to be our answer, because it's quite frankly the only one that seems to make sense and apply to this question. We're talking about separation of powers between the executive and legislative, and an executive order is something that might motivate Congress if the president were making such a threat regarding gun control. Okay, next up in the outline, explain how presidents have interpreted and justified their use of formal and informal powers. Justifications for a single executive are set forth in Federalist 70. term of office and constitutional power restrictions, including passage of the 22nd Amendment. Demonstrate changing presidential roles. The 22nd Amendment put the two-term limit, so this was after Roosevelt was president, to limit the power of the president so he can only serve 2 terms. And then finally, explain how communication technology has changed the president's relationship with the national constituency and the other branches. And don't forget, the president does have a national constituency. Of course, every member of Congress serves the whole country, but they also serve their states. But the president serves the whole country, every state in the union. So it's a different constituency. The communication impact of the presidency can be demonstrated through such factors as modern technology, social media, rapid response to political issues, nationally broadcast State of the Union messages. Now, the State of the Union speech is probably the single most important moment in a typical presidential year, because it is the one time where you have a captive audience of House members where you can state your agenda and gauge reaction by members of Congress and invite VIP guests to further push that agenda. And it has all the pageantry and all the attention, and it's the one thing that every year people tend to notice. And it can set the stage for the policy agenda the president wants to put forth. So very, very important. And of course, everybody knows about social media with President Trump's unprecedented use of Twitter, which is really something new. I think that Twitter's been around since 2008, but until President Trump, it was never used the way he's using it. If there's something negative he doesn't like, he immediately tweets out about it. He retweets things, and because he's the president, this is a bully pulpit, you can't ignore the guy. You can't ignore the president. When he tweets something, it's going to get attention. I think the problem Trump is having is he oversaturates the Twitterverse with tweets, maybe to the point that it just becomes noise. But still, no question that it's been a different deal under President Trump. All right, last question in this section. In Federalist 70, Alexander Hamilton states that energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. In this statement, Hamilton is arguing in favor of the need for a single executive who can respond quickly to crisis. And if you've read this, you already know that's the answer. But just for fun, a president who has a good understanding of public policy, an electoral college in the selection of the president, a president who is youthful and assertive. Single executive who can respond quickly to crises. That is exactly what Federalist 70 was about. And energy in the executive, we could probably translate to power. And of course, most of us now recognize that there are many times when presidential leadership is expected. And even some very unpopular presidents have done things during times of crises. I vividly remember when 9/11 occurred and George W. Bush, who was wildly unpopular by most standards at that time. And of course, you guys were all too young to remember this, but when 9/11 occurred and when George W. Bush grabbed a bullhorn kind of impromptu and climbed on top of the pile of debris after 9/11 had occurred, just days after it occurred, and said,
I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.